Hello, people of Earth. Welcome back to another Parallel Perception podcast with Lujan Matus. I'm the host, David Bernard. We talk on this podcast. If you haven't seen us before, it's all the things. We talk about the human condition, what it means to evolve along our path as individuals, and collectively, we get into aliens and politics and spirituality and metaphysics and esoterica and everything in between. So if you have a question, you want to know more, email us at info@parallelperception.com. Okay. So now, today, we have a special guest. His name is Kyle Vandenbroek. He's a part of the community. He has been here almost as long as I have, I think. And we welcome you to the podcast today, Kyle. It's good to have you here.
Thanks so much, David. It's good to be here.
Absolutely. So you recently had an interview with Lujan that is on the Parallel Perception channel. You guys talked about the truths of Yeshua. I find that my background in Christianity creeps into the conversation often. I always find it, let's see, how can I phrase this? I don't love talking too much about my specific background in Christianity because I think it's a very polarizing thing. I think that if I, for instance, say that I don't identify as Christian anymore, then the Christian community is going to pray for me and feel like I've fallen in some kind of a way, and I don't need that. And on the other hand, I don't want to disparage people that are Christians. Like the spirituality takes many forms, and what you get out of it is any pursuit of some higher ideal than yourself, I think, has value. And so I wanted to pick this up, though, because you seem to have a similar background to me, and what you guys did where you were reading the passage and you were sort of uncovering maybe the not so obvious truths laden within the text that you were reading was really beautiful. And I wanted to see if we could keep that conversation going. This is something that I geek out on because I didn't stop my education in Christianity with the Bible and what I was taught in church. I actually wasn't raised in Christianity. I was raised by my father and mother, who identified as different things, spiritual but not religious. And then my dad was an atheist for a long time, and then eventually that changed, and so I followed suit with my dad, basically. But I also read a bunch of the Gnostic texts. I have a copy of the Nag Hammadi library. I've read some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it seems to fill in some of the gaps of what's contained in the actual Bible itself. And Lujan references the Gospel of Thomas a lot. And that was, when I read that, this was before I ever met Lujan, what it felt like to me is when you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and maybe even Romans and Acts and some of those, you get the sense that people are recalling experiences that they might have had in the past. And they're framing the conversation around who they're talking to, and sort of cherry picking things, maybe, and they might have even had some gaps in their memory of things. When you read the Gospel of Thomas, it sounds like somebody was there with a notepad in hand or sticky notes or something like that, and writing as fast as they could as Jesus was talking in real time. That was my sense of it. And so, Kyle, I wanted to see if you wanted to kick this off with a specific question, or if you'd like me to try to see if I could find a specific spot where we could jump in.
Yeah, well, what you're talking about makes me think about growing up in the church, having that specific framework of a belief system that I had, this is how I'm supposed to interpret these scriptures. And then there came a point where I had to kind of deconstruct what was given to me. And then the process of that deconstruction kind of left me in a limbo space of kind of uncertainty, and then moving into that reconstructing my own perspective on things, and learning from new teachers like Lujan and those esoteric pieces. Yeah, so I don't know. I'm curious, Lujan, about that process of having an orthodoxy perspective about a book, right? This is what's given to us, and how do we break out of that? But how do we also move into something new and fresh, or if that's necessary at all?
Well, geez, everybody has specific frameworks that they go through their life. They believe something when they're 20, and when they're 30, they reassess what they believe in terms of their experience or their emotional disruption because you get emotionally disrupted. Something is tested inside of you, and then your whole belief system changes in comparison to the collapse of a belief system, and then you find yourself in a new area of exploration where we actually look at the world in a different way, which then deconstructs the old understanding and then starts to build a new framework that relates to your experience. So anything that relates to your experience is more valid than what you read. But you can read something and say that, and then fit it into your experience, and that's not really real enough. But you've got to take your experience and look at what has been given to us in text, and then take the abstract that's hidden in between the words and what's the hidden meaning of it, and then discover what's really there. Yeah. Everyone's stunned.
This speaks directly to where I got stuck with Christianity, actually, is that when I was in Bible study, I would often glean different things, not having been raised in Christianity and been, for lack of a better word, indoctrinated in the same kind of way. I had to come to Christianity on my own, for my own ideas around it. It wasn't something that was taught to me. And so what I would bring into Bible study was often totally in a different place than the way that everybody else in the group had regarded those passages. And that was really the sticking point for me, is I had a hard time accepting that I needed a translator or an advocate or somebody who could parlay directly with God, and that it had to be disseminated to them and then from them to me. I also felt like at that point I didn't know that I'd necessarily had like what they would regard as a religious experience or a Jesus experience, or I wasn't in a Pentecostal church or anything like that where we spoke in tongues, and so I was insecure about my conception of God and spirituality and what all of that meant. But it was something that was like, it was real to me, I was trying to set out on a journey to have these experiences so that I could know God directly. And I felt like most of what I was being taught was that we have to kneel, literally be on a lower level than the pulpit at the front of the church, where they literally were speaking down to us. And so, I think that if you're not speaking from experience, then you're just reiterating some idea that you have about something, and that was where I got stuck, really. But Kyle, please jump in and tell me. I want to know your experience too. I don't want to put a bad taste in anybody's mouth about this. These are my ideas about my experience and yeah, my resistances to some of this stuff. And I don't want to, like, it's not a judgment of anybody else. It's just my resistance to my experience. So
it feels like the sincerity in which someone approaches their faith is like the most important part. Like I'm growing up, like I remember having all this, like, it was so important about what you believed. Like your belief system was really, really, really fundamental. And like you have to believe in Jesus and you have to believe these certain doctrines in order to be saved. And what I found was like my innocence is what maybe opened me to like being able to experience God in like really profound ways when I was really young. And it was like it's not something that I necessarily believed, but was just maybe open to experiencing. But as I like got like late, like as I like started to like get taught about doctrines, as I had those really pure, beautiful, loving experiences with Jesus, like feeling like total love, like all consuming in my body, and then like tacked on were these dogmas and these doctrines and these belief systems that kind of contorted that experience. And it took a long time to kind of like suss those out and break them apart, which sounds like a little bit different from your experience, which is you coming in with kind of fresh eyes into the church, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Well, when you look at it, sorry, Dave, when you really look at it, if you say that the feeling in my chest is the kingdom that I reside within, and the kingdom that I reside within in terms of the spirit that comes, or the spirit of the experience that comes inside of your body, you interpret that by your own capacity to to assimilate information on the level of consciousness where you are, on the level of your heart. But once it becomes cerebral and you pack things into your mind, then it becomes dogma because you want to follow exactly what's being said to you, and you're led down a path of absolutely believing without any credible proof of that belief having a foundation within your feeling center. So it's so they say with only the children or the innocent can enter the kingdom through the feeling of their innocence. So when you look at this, your innocence is a very, very vulnerable state. Everything that comes towards that vulnerability is accounted for in terms of what enters you. And as it enters you, what determines your consciousness is your reaction. So if the reaction is like in the form of not doing your reaction, you become composed of the information which gets absorbed into your heart center, and then you can truly see what's harmonious and what's dissident in your environment, so you don't integrate the dissident element, and you keep your faith in terms of your feelings of gratitude toward your situational attunement. So everything that comes into the level of your feeling is actually the kingdom that resides within you, and the knowledge that grows upon that feeling is truly your experience. Because you can think about something, you can talk about something, but people will think about the experience and go back to the feeling which offended them, and then they put the thinking process into what offended them, and then that's how dogma releases itself from the heart process into a cerebral, compact information that doesn't want to release you from the box that contains you within your judgment of other people's nature of not being in harmony with the environment. So if we look at our experience and we can forgive somebody for what they do, even if it takes a certain amount of time, because you have to release yourself from a situation which has wounded you, so that you can heal from the bleeding of the center of your chest. And as soon as that wound heals, it leaves a formula or a type of scar which makes you realize that when somebody comes along that has sort of familiar traits, you will actually see that, and then you can then release your voice and your experience upon that person to actually educate them that they're going down the wrong path, because you've experienced that path previously on your feeling center, instead of going back to dogma and teaching them from a dogmatic perspective, this is what you should do, this is what you shouldn't do, this is what I've experienced instead, and this is what I don't want to happen in my life, and I can see you coming at me from this directive. Can I purify your intention so that you become adhered or joined or in a state of matrimony, which you marry your circumstances, so it becomes union or yoking. Yeah. So I guess that's all I got to say about that.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because Jesus calls out the Pharisees. He says, "You're a brood of vipers." Like, you guys, these religious leaders who are like basically putting their rules and laws on the people and like making them work like really hard and being really, really strict about how they should live. And Jesus was about empathic communion and being empathic towards one another and actually feeling where each other are at rather than where we expect each other to be at.
Yeah. So if you look at this, let's just say we look at the framework of Neigong, or internal work, which is basically the whole internal system of Lo Man Pai, is if I can increase my energy field to encompass you while you're near me, and I can increase it by about 12 feet, you're in the area of that field, and you feel comfortable. If somebody comes to your energy field and they're violent, you contract because you don't want them in your energy field, because you know that they're not worthy of that type of trust. So then you contract completely. So if we're told that we're not that we've got to follow somebody else, and we're in a state of contraction because what they're saying is dogmatic, and we want to trust them, but we go into contraction, we can't expand, because we expand into the field of somebody who's telling us what to do, which isn't in relationship with an empathic perspective, or a state of union, or a state of yoking. In terms of our energy field expanding into each other, we become one being. If one or more gather within my name, I will appear. So how can anybody appear if one person's in contraction and one person expanding dogma, and then another person adheres to the dogma? There's a form of contraction there, because they're forcing the open-hearted person to try and get them to agree with dogma instead of agreeing with union or yoking. So they're two totally different affairs.
it's interesting to me that I do think that there's a surprising amount of deep, deep truths contained within the Bible and certainly within the words of Jesus. But there are some, in my estimation, from my perspective, and I'm not speaking for anybody else, severe flaws in the entire paradigm of the Christian dogma. And you're speaking to that in a way, I think, Lujan, is that it's presented as an authority on what spirituality and human evolution looks like. I mean, evolution is the wrong word. Their whole concept is salvation and grace, which I want to like talk about it without offending anybody, and I want to approach the subject of salvation and grace without causing some kind of disruption. But there's a truth that needs to be like parlayed.
Let's have a look at this way: salvation and grace. Okay. So just imagine that somebody gives their life experience to you, and it's very, very valid life experience to someone who's immature. They're younger, or even if they're older, they've got an immature perspective. They don't have the capacity to assimilate enormous amounts of information. So you give them a faithful account of your own life experience to the beckoning of their beckoning you on the level of your spirit to give an answer which is appropriate to their situational attunement. So you speak to their situational attunement, they feel the gravity of your communion, and with the gravity of that communion, they put down the cerebral localized effect of dogma or social engineering, quite frankly. And they put this down, and then they're in a state of grace because they realize they've heard something which actually debunks the mind and then delivers them a feeling of in their heart. And it's always very, very practical. It's never non-practical because everything that has wisdom within it is extremely, extremely simple, very, very practical, but it has enormous elements of realization encompassed within it. So that's why the Gnostics were never embraced in the church, because the Gnostic would say they would take one particular element and expand in 20 different directions because of 20 different realizations they have from the one doctrine. And if they do that, then the church has lost control of them, because the narrative is being split into separate wisdoms from the capacity of each person's consciousness to interpret that. So then it becomes the group consciousness that just say you had these people in a room, everybody would have a different visual capacity to understand what's being said because they visually look at it. And then from the level of feeling, there's a union of feeling, but there's a different aspect of realization in terms of the visual composite of information that comes up. Then that gives the capacity of the feeling to have words in comparison to what they visually manifested in terms of what they understand. So then everybody has the capacity to itemize themselves in a way which is drastically different to the 10th person along the line, but the feeling is the same, because we all revolve around the one feeling, and the one feeling is the communion, but the different aspects of that communion has the different qualities of every individual that has an inspiration which corresponds to the level of their heart consciousness, and that individual capacity is like being in war. So you don't want the directive to go this direction and someone says, well, I'm going to go to the left or the right. Everyone's going in the same direction because that's the momentum of the whole group. But everybody will be faced with a different type of defense of their own body. And everybody will swing their swords in a different way. And it's exactly the same with consciousness. Everybody swings their consciousness in a different way, and they end up with a different outcome in terms of the trials and tribulations, or the blockages, or the situations which challenge them. And that's and we're in a world of quite difficult dichotomy, because we've got much evil and much goodness in this planet, and that's meant to be there. We're meant to be challenged by this to define who we're going to become, and that division between good and bad is there for a reason, to help you decide who you're going to be and whether you're comfortable with that. A lot of people are comfortable with being bad people. A lot of people aren't comfortable with that, and they become better and better and better at soaking themselves into circumstance righteously instead of soaking themselves into circumstance selfishly. I'm terrible, and I guys.
It's interesting because like I'm like in my experience, like when I had these mystical experiences when I was a kid, I felt shame when I was a young kid. Now, was that and when I had those mystical experiences, I felt like absolute love and like a release from that shame and a release from a type of bondage. Was that bondage put on me by social engineering and a product of the church, right? That's the question. So then they just put a bondage on you, and then they say, "Oh, we can save you."
Yeah, let's look at the fundamental root of your shame and embarrassment. You were a very young man at that stage, maybe 12 or 13. Is it right? Yeah. Now, 12 and 13, what were you doing? Beating your meat crazily.
It's exactly. I was watching porn, baby.
So the shame comes from actually exploring your sexuality. So then it's easy to be put in a state of shame. Now, the reason that it's easy to put you in shame when you release your sexual energy is because you lose your spiritual potency. Because the seed is meant to be kept inside of your body, so it ascends through your spine into the spinal cerebral fluid, which fills the brain, and then you're supposed to activate your pineal gland for once a month for maximum insights and maximum revealing of the truth which arises within you. Because in a lot of these groups, they get together on a holy day of the week, and they'll talk about go and talk about the experiences that you've had the last week, and what are your insights from that. That's a Gnostic perspective, isn't it? So they're asking everybody to share what they've realized, but if you empty your semen, then you can't share anything because you're in a state of shame. If you're in a state of shame, you collapse your heart center. So the first thing that you say, it's pretty obvious that you were just a young man, and you were probably given shame about your sexuality. So whenever you expressed your need to evolve into this area, because it's screaming at you, you wake up every morning, your hormones are really high, and you got this Woody looking at you, and you're going, what am I meant to do with this? And you're all by yourself, so you experiment with that, but then you're given shame later on in terms of what you've done with it. But it's not the shame of that is important. It's actually the education of what you shouldn't do, what you should and shouldn't do in terms of evolving with that type of energy. And as young people, we have so much energy in this area, and and we have so much passion, so much love, and so much expansion of our heart center, which is erroneously connected to the sexual center, but not really erroneously, because you can love so deeply another person the same age as you, and everyone will say you're not in love. I have very, very specific memories when I was very young, loving a person exactly the same age as me, and the adults who were telling me you can't possibly be experiencing pure love, and I remember it very clearly. They forgot what pure love felt like in terms of the expansion of finding somebody else, the opposite sex, that you truly adore, and all of the energy goes into that, and you wait patiently for this person to come upon you, and it's always connected to your sexual center and your heightened hormones, your heightened heart center, and everything like this, and your tactile response is so alive, and that's the biggest mistake I think's been made with young people is not to educate them about the vitality that they've got and how to direct that vitality without it becoming dogma and rigidly held in a position where they become the what do you call the poster person of what's been taught to them, instead of becoming held within the process of their own loving embrace of another individual, or the embrace of their own sexuality coming up to the surface, and not really being educated about it in an intelligent way. It's usually given shame instead of a prosperous education about what you should do with this area of your growth as a human being. And I think, and I don't really think, I really believe that the young individuals have kind of lost their way a little bit when it comes to this. If their preacher or their parents aren't willing enough to get in there and say, this is what you need to do with this very, very potent spiritual energy that you've got arising within you, that's hit your heart so strongly. And you know what it's like. Yeah, it's interesting. It seems like grace is a doorway that you walk through, and it's like there's lots of different doorways, but grace, the real authentic grace, is like coming to deep communion with yourself and acceptance of yourself and everything around you. Yeah. And you know, everything that, let's say, let's backtrack to when you were 12 and 13. If I was to say to you what you experienced, I really forgive you, and I really understand that you weren't given the right information, and this guilt is set very, very strong in your body. I'd say release yourself from your guilt, because you can't change what you've done from then till now. You can only realize that you can give somebody else another perspective because of what you missed in terms of how you were taught from 12 till right now. And then you've got a great resource. And the resources of a mistake are, quite frankly, much more rich than the resource of a pious person that doesn't have this experience. So they don't have the shame or the education of this, because they've gone the right way down the path, but they've been so righteously down the path that the past has squeezed them into a small area of dogma that doesn't allow them to see that people are allowed to make mistakes. Yeah. Especially with the vessel that they're born within, because that's the main thing we're meant to do. We're meant to experience this body. We're meant to make mistakes with everything we do with this body and this perception, and that becomes a well of information in terms of how much you can obtain from all of the minor mistakes you've made through your life. And even someone who's pious, they're still making minor mistakes within their life. But can they see those minor mistakes as an accumulative effect of dogma, or can they see those minor mistakes as an opening towards wisdom? Dogma and wisdom, two different things in terms of the rigidity of how we're being taught. Because Kyle, who you are right now doesn't necessarily make you the person you are today in terms of your communication, but who you were then emotionally. Still, there's something there inside which that guilt is something else to put on top of the guilt that you gained when you were from 12 to 13 up to now. Somebody else can put something on there that's very similar in feeling. You'll just pack that guilt in, and then you'll be writhing with that guilt up to this particular point, instead of coming to terms with the fact you made simple mistakes. And those simple mistakes are a point of education for you. Yeah. Instead of someone going, those mistakes, you're going to go to hell. I mean, hell is propelled onto somebody by giving them the feeling that they're not worthy. That's hell.
And so the mistakes become the grace, really. The mistakes are a beautiful gift for us.
Yeah. Yeah.
That turn into wisdom. And soften our hearts to people who have experienced that same thing, instead of being aggressive and attacking and saying you should be this, you should be that, which maybe we do to ourselves. But if we can find that place of grace inside of ourselves, we can be forgiving to others.
Yeah. That's it. So it's acceptance. And then transformation through acceptance is different from transformation by not accepting. So that locks somebody into dogma by not accepting their mistakes and allowing them to gain wisdom from those particular mistakes. By not doing them, and by not doing those mistakes, you grow into a different person. Yeah. But pretending you didn't make those mistakes when you get older.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah, because somehow we have this belief that, like, if I show my mistakes, it's weakness and people won't respect me.
Maybe there's two ways to look at this. If you show your mistakes, you can put yourself in a position to be judged, or you know your mistakes and you love people for their capacity to make those mistakes, and then say, well, I've actually made a mistake because you've accepted me. Then accepting those mistakes help them change. But to lock them into the mistake will not allow them to change. But there's got to be a small framework where you don't stand for that, because that's your righteousness. And then that righteousness disappears as their character changes. If their character doesn't change, then your righteousness has to stay severe, because then they don't have entry to your life, because you open up that door, they pollute your heart. You know, there's sayings from the biblical perspective, don't let the enemy indoors. Anyway, I've made everyone very quiet now.
We're soaking it up.
I have strong You're ringing a lot of bells for me that are like formative experiences in my life that are all kinds of twisted up in my relationship with religion and all of those things. I was kind of, I was the firstborn of my parents' generation, and so I was the first grandchild, first son, all of those things. I was in advanced classes in school. Everybody thought I was going to be a doctor or a lawyer, and everybody was hanging their hopes on me, and so for the first chapter of my life, I did what was expected of me. I was very much not totally having agent. I mean, I was a kid, but looking back, I didn't totally have agency over my interests and my decisions, and I was following the path that they had laid out for me. And I very clearly remember making a decision when I was in college and I was 19 years old that I could try to do something that felt a little wrong, that I could experiment with drugs, or I could have sex, or I could do things that my parents might look down on me for, but that it would be my experience and my choice, and whatever I would learn from it would be mine. I didn't want my decisions not to be mine anymore. And the other thing that came out of that is at some point, a couple decades later after that, I remember making connect. I had a moment of realization, and Luhan, you were part of this, of inventorying my past in a way where I was reflecting on that period before that decision, of always being the good boyfriend, of always, getting the lead roles in the school dramas, of always getting straight A's, of all of these things, and thinking that I was spotless during this chapter of my life. And then all of a sudden, these memories started to creep in sideways at me, where I started to have realizations of all the people that I had hurt through decisions that I made and the way that I operated, by just being kind of obtuse around the knock-on effect of my choices and the way that I carried myself and how I formed relationships and when I chose to end them and all those kinds of things. And so everything that you just said, Luhan, it's like it's resonating so profoundly with that. It's like framing it. It's like a validation of that. But these are all like intuitive. I haven't had it so forward on my tongue up to this point that we have to go through that. And we do ourselves a disservice to think that we're upstanding and we're righteous and we're minimizing the sin in our life and we're walking the straight and narrow path, because we start to define ourselves based on a framework that is very rigid and very tight, and it starts to create blinders that creep in on you, and the perspective that you have gets narrowed. You don't realize the negative consequence of not considering people empathically in a way of accepting them as they are and where they're standing. So anyway, I guess that's my testimony.
But let's like I'll describe what happened to me as a child, and maybe then Kyle can reflect on this as well. The first thing that I noticed in my situation as a child, that I could literally cut the air, and I didn't like the feeling. It felt demonic, it felt evil, it felt forced, it felt violent, and it was silent, and it was surrounding me, and it coveted me. It was like a cloak of darkness which was folding over my heart. And I said, I don't want anything to do with this. And then I was the black sheep of the family. I just did not agree with anything. But the only thing I had on the tip of my tongue was, that doesn't feel right what you're doing. I don't want to be involved in this. Don't do that. We can do better than this. So that was my experience, and that isolated me and pushed me into a very, very difficult position, because everybody was conceiving, oh, this guy, he can't put two sentences together. All he does is disagree. He can't communicate. He can't read. He can't write, because everything closed me in, and I couldn't learn anything because everything I knew wasn't allowed to be expressed. So I didn't want to learn anything else because I wasn't being validated as a young human being. And that was the difference between now and then. Now I have the voice to express what I really know, but the small voice I had then was like I could cut the air with scissors, because it was so thick and so tense and so horrible. But when I spoke the words, it's sort of like pushed the darkness away, and it got clear for a little second, and then it smacked back in, and they started to discipline me because that didn't suit them. So then there was a spiritual warfare, as far as I'm concerned, to be free of this timeline that I was dropped into. It was like a poisonous well, and and they were saying, drink the water, and I said no. So Kyle, what was your experience?
Yeah, well, I'm just thinking about my time as a pastor, actually. Like, I was a pastor for 5 years, and I felt this pressure inside of me. Like, if I actually told people what I actually believe or thought about things, like my community would say, like, you're a wolf in sheep's clothing. You're leading all of our kids astray, because I was a youth pastor. And at the time I was doing psychedelics, and I was going to sweat lodges and doing that sort of thing. And so, like, very much like thinking like, okay, there's a lot more, like, God is way bigger than I had anticipated before. So I had expanded in a really beautiful sense when I went to Ireland, and I was able to really express myself in a really clear and concise way, and like be myself fully. And then I went back into the like sphere of the church, and it kind of constricted me again, because I knew what kind of expectations they would have on me how they would look at me if I actually spoke my truth.
Well, the most amazing word you're using is constricted. What does a boa constrictor do? It stops your movements, it stops your expression, it stops you from even having enough breath to speak about your situation because you're tired. Mercilessly, well, I can't even get the word out, but you're going to be eaten alive.
Yeah, and so if people are stuck in that place, I mean, what are the methods, and how do you get out of that situation?
Quite frankly, I don't know the answer to that one. If we're tied up by a big boa.
I'll tell you my experience of it. For me, it was a crisis of faith. I remember asking myself, I hadn't rejected the doctrine, I hadn't rejected the book, I hadn't rejected Jesus, I rejected the community, I rejected the religion, and I had a moment of like, how if what I believe is true, and if I don't accept Jesus into my heart as my salvation, then what is walking away from that? How do you walk away from that? What is I'm literally would be risking hell if what the belief was, if it was true, right. I'd be risking hell. And if you hit an impasse, how do you walk away from that? And it at some point it coalesces into something that is pressurized to such a degree that you just have to walk away, or you have to let go, or you have to turn, you just bow your head and you jump blindly into the abyss and hope for a soft sand. It wasn't a choice, it was a need.
And then you stumble across Luhan.
Well, that came much later. I would say I stopped identifying as a Christian about the time I met my wife, and that was 14 years ago. And it was kind of slow. There was this weird little, because she comes from a very different background than me, and so there was this weird little awkward state where I'm still trying to proselytize a little bit to my wife, and that caused a lot of conflict between us. And then she opened me up to some things. I also went to acupuncture school and started getting introduced to Taoist and Buddhist philosophies, and that was kind of, all of that happened together. And I think I needed a new perspective informed by a new philosophy to be able to release my chokehold on the former.
Totally. And that was the same thing for me. I had to leave the church, get into a completely new environment. And Luhan, you talk about this a lot, where it's like an empathic person needs to have that warm, loving space in order for them to expand. And so as I started to expand more into myself, I can kind of look back on my Christian community and have more compassion, and also like look at the teachings of Jesus and feel a lot more able to see them with purity.
Yeah, there was a time when I think Yeshua was 12 years old till his early 20s, where he wasn't available, and he traveled through India, he traveled through Tibet, and they've got documents about him, and his name was Isha, and he was seen much more superior than a Dalai Lama. So he was seen as a pure holy man, and I've had visions of Yeshua, and it's been very, very, very beautiful. And my faith towards this particular individual is unshakable. The same way my faith towards Buddha is unshakable. Now there was an experience when I was a young boy. There was this old house, and I was with a very, very naughty friend of mine that used to walk on his toes. He never walked on his heels. He was so naughty. Had blonde hair. We went into this old house that was going to be pulled down, and he pulled down a picture of Yeshua. He calls it Jesus, and threw it on the ground and stomped on it. And I waited for a bolt of lightning to come down and destroy us, because he is the representation of the abstract, representation of the encompassing elements of a universal consciousness, which birthed itself within the small frame of a human representation of this. And that's and when you get to that particular stage, you are the embodiment of the abstract. When your heart is open, like his was, and his is, because maybe even at 3 o'clock in the morning, when I feel that I'm being trapped, all I got to do is concentrate into the stars and just ask God or Yeshua to deliver me from my suffering. It happens immediately. It never happens with Buddha. Yeah, pretty interesting, hey?
Luhan, do you ascribe to this idea? This is not exactly a Christian idea, but I've read it in other books about Christianity, about Jesus specifically, that the Christhood is sort of this, that Jesus the man had to purify himself to a state in order to allow the Christhood to descend upon him and operate through him. That was like the God consciousness using him as a vessel to speak, and that when he's speaking to the disciples and to the masses, that sometimes Jesus the man is talking and sometimes the Christhood is talking through him.
Well, I think Yeshua was a pure expression of the Absolute. So, being a pure expression of the Absolute, he was speaking on behalf. He represent that. I'm speaking on behalf of my Father. The Father, and he was the Son, and the Holy Spirit is the representation of his spirit consciousness in terms of the diversification of the words, which is represented in every single circumstance. So that spirit consciousness, and this can be related, very, very strongly related into Taoism in terms of what is spirit mind. Spirit mind is something that you express when you evolve to a certain degree. Your body is the vessel, and then you realize the abstract is the influence that comes through that vessel. Spirit mind is the expression of that. So there are three particular stages: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, or spirit mind, the body, and the vessel that comes through the voice of an empath. So it's all represented, and it's all exactly the same. It's just a matter of being stuck in a world where there are so many divisions, so many different religions to say I'm right, but in actuality, when you get to a certain stage, there's a state of grace, and all dogma has to be released to assign yourself to that grace, and the grace then opens up your heart to the prospect of having faith, and faith puts you into a state of gratitude. And a state of gratitude, it encompasses that faith, and you can pass that on through a level of feeling. So it's not what someone says, it's what that person is doing that is a representation of spirit. And because words can be misinterpreted, but actions can't.
Kyle, can I bring you into this? This makes me think of this is one of the places where I got stuck too, is that the concept of grace is that you receive something that you haven't earned and you couldn't possibly earn because you're not pure enough to earn it. The idea that nobody has earned their way through works into heaven, that God had to sacrifice his only son because he was the only one pure enough to make a sacrifice that could blanket the entirety of humanity and allow for them passage into, the ultimate state of purification. Oh, I'm getting wiped. Let me see if I can pull it back. This happens, guys. This happens when you talk to Lou a lot. So, okay. So in terms of grace, where was I going with this? In terms of grace, shit.
You're an incomplete being. You're an incomplete being. In order to receive grace, you need to be an incomplete being. But are you actually an incomplete being? You're always a complete being at all times, right? We're whole.
Yeah. Is
that kind of where you're going?
Where I was going to go is that You're not saved by your works is the idea. You have to be saved by grace, but you can't receive grace unless you choose it. You choose to accept it, which is
Okay, what is grace? The first thing is, what is grace? Grace is the representation of the purity of a child.
Right. I think it's a catch-22. I think grace is a state. It's a state that you enter into, and so there's a component to it that requires a series of actions through, over the course of your life that continues to shift your perspective, to shift your energetic body, to shift where you're at on your path over time, and eventually you enter into a state of grace. That's how I think of it. But
okay, let me ask you a question, Dave. Sorry, I'm bumping into you. What happens when you put something rigid up, and you put something rigid up, and then you're challenged by your wife, and what happens to that rigidness? That rigidness breaks down when you realize that all that matters is a pure feeling of communion. Yeah. Then the belief system is broken down by the feeling of being open enough to receive something, which is you're not fighting for the right to defend something. You're fighting for actually the situation is fighting for the right to open up to the acceptance of somebody else. And when you accept somebody else, they go into a state of childlike abandon as well, because the acceptance drops their forceful, no, you can't do this, and you say, well, I want to do it this way. And then that stops that. And then as soon as you both drop that, you go into a state of childlike grace. You end up hugging, kissing, and saying, oh, please forgive me. We were so silly for arguing. It's only forgiveness and the state of acceptance in terms of opening up. And then you go meet somebody outside of your marriage, and they pop you back into defending yourself again. You go back home and do it all over again, because you're so familiar with that state of conflict or division, non-communion. I'm sorry, guys.
No, that's all good. I think this is something that is discussed a lot, at least in my tenure, was discussed a lot, is whether or not you can earn your way through works into heaven. And it's like it is this catch-22 that there's an aspect to the actions that you take in your life that have to do with where you end up and the trajectory of your life and where you end up. But you can't set out to win grace by committing the right number of righteous acts in order to earn God's favor or something like that.
It's like you have to stop trying to get enlightenment in order to actually be able to possibly get enlightened.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, Scott. Absolutely true.
Yeah. Kyle, thank you so much for joining us today. Lujan, as always, we love you. And for everybody that's listening, please keep coming back, like, subscribe, share, do all the things. Any questions that you have, you can email us at info@parallelperception.com. We just started a free community that you can also inquire about through emailing us, and we'll let you in, and you'll get to have a conversation with other people like us, for better or worse. Lots of love. Take care. Okay, today, oh shit, I gotta do that again. Kyle, forgot your last name. Is it Vandenbroek?
Vandenbroek.
Okay, so we'll start over. Shit. Okay. Vandenbroek. Okay. Here we go. Hello, people of Earth. Welcome back to another episode of the Parallel Perception Podcast with Lujan Matus. I'm your host, David Bernard. Today, we have a very special guest, Kyle Vandenbroek. Did I say that right?
I got it.
I got it right, and I screwed it up anyway. God damn it. Hello, people of Earth. Welcome back to another Parallel Perception. Hello, people of Earth. Welcome back to another Parallel Perception Podcast with Lujan Matus. Say that 5 times fast. Okay, we're going to do it again. Ta-da!
Ta-da. Well, that was heavy shit.
That was some heavy shit. We went around fences.